Welcome to Radio Intifada, voices from Calcutta to Casablanca, voices of struggle, voices for change. We are broadcasting on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, and streaming live at www.kpfk.org. I'm Hagit Borer. There's little question in anybody's mind of the special relationship between Israel and the United States. Israel is the largest recipient of American foreign aid to the tune of more than $3 billion a year, plus miscellaneous additional aid in surplus weaponry, debt waivers, and other perks. Israel is the only country that receives its entire aid in the beginning of the fiscal year, allowing it to accrue interest on it during the year. It's the only country that is allowed to spend up to 25% of its aid outside the United States, placing such expenditures outside U.S. control. Apart from financial support, the United States had offered unwavering support for the Israeli occupation and for the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians, and has systematically cooperated with Israel's refusal to enter any effective peace negotiations or peace agreements. It has vetoed countless UN resolutions seeking to condemn Israel and to bring it into compliance with international law. It has allowed Israel to develop nuclear weapons and not to sign the Anti-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and most recently, it strongly supported Israel's attack on Lebanon in July of 2006. Support for Israel cuts across party lines and is extremely strong in Congress, where criticism of Israel is rarely, if ever, heard. It also characterizes almost all American administrations from Johnson onwards, with George W. Bush being possibly the most pro-Israeli president ever. What is the reason for this strong support? Opinions on this matter vary greatly. Within strong pro-Israeli circles, one often hears that the reason is primarily moral. The debt that the United States owes Israel in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the nature of Israel as the sole democracy in the Middle East, Israel as a moral and possibly strategic ally of the United States in its war on terror. Within circles that are less supportive of Israel and which are less inclined to view Israel and Israel's conduct as moral, opinions vary as well. One perspective is that the U.S. support of Israel stems from Israel being a strategic asset to the United States. Its support is simply payment for services rendered, coupled with the stable pro-American stance of the Jewish Israeli population. Noam Chomsky, among others, is a proponent of this view. According to the opposing view, United States support for Israel does not advance American foreign policy aims, it jeopardizes them. The explanation for the support is to be found in the activities of the Israel Lobby, also known as the Jewish Lobby, or as AIPAC, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, which uses its formidable influence to shape American foreign policy in accordance with Israeli interests. This perspective has most recently been associated with an article in the London Book Review authored by Professors Mearsheimer of Chicago University and Professor Walt of Harvard University. This debate is the topic of our program today. Let me introduce our guests. Norman Finkelstein is a professor of political science at DePaul University. Welcome to our program, Norman. Norman?
I'm here.
Okay. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Professor Finkelstein is the author of a number of books and articles on the history of Zionism and on the role of Holocaust in Israeli present-day policies. His latest book, published in 2005, is Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. Our second guest is James Petras. James is an emeritus professor of sociology at SUNY Binghamton. Welcome to our program, James.
Glad to be here, Hagit.
Okay. Professor Petras is the author of numerous books and articles on the making of state power and globalization in the context of the U.S. and Latin America, and most recently in the Middle East. His latest book, published in 2006, is titled The Power of Israel in the United States. Perhaps starting with you, James, maybe you could tell us just by way of a short opening statement where you would place yourself on this issue of a debate on the source of the United States' lasting and enduring support of Israel.
Well, I think I would strongly argue that the pro-Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, is the dominant factor in shaping U.S. policy, particularly in the most recent period. And I think one has to look at this beyond AIPAC. I mean, we have to look at a whole string of pro-Zionist think tanks from the American Enterprise Institute on down, and then we have to look at a whole power configuration which not only involves AIPAC, but the president of the major American Jewish organizations, which number 52. We have to look at individuals occupying crucial positions in the government, as we had recently with Elliott Abrams and Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and others. We have to look at the army of op-ed writers who have access to the major newspapers. We have to look at the super-rich contributors to the Democratic Party, media moguls, etc. And I think this, together with the leverage in Congress and in the executive, is the decisive factor in shaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And I want to
James,
emphasize
just to stop you, and maybe we can also have some kind of an opening statement from Norman.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I would say I situate myself on the spectrum somewhere towards the middle. I don't think it's just the lobby which determines the U.S. relationship with Israel, and I don't think it's U.S. interests that just determine the U.S. relationship with Israel. I think that you have to look at the broad picture, and then you have to look at the local picture. On the broad picture, that is to say, U.S. policy in the Middle East, generally speaking, the historical connection between the U.S. and Israel has been based on the useful services that Israel has performed for the United States in the region as a whole. And that became most prominent in June 1967, when Israel knocked out the main challenge or potential challenge to U.S. dominance in the region, namely Abdel Nasser of Egypt. So on the broad question of the U.S.-Israel relationship, that is the regional relationship, I think it's correct to say that the alliance has been based fundamentally on services rendered. On the other hand, it's very clear from looking at the documentary record, just as it's clear from looking at a documentary record, that the U.S. was euphoric when Israel knocked out Egypt, or knocked out Nasserism. It's also clear from looking at the documentary record that the United States has never had any big stake in trying to maintain Israel's control over the territories it conquered in the June 1967 war. That is to say, the Egyptian Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, and at that time, the Jordanian West Bank and Jerusalem. The U.S. clearly had no stake in it, and from very early, already from July 1967, wanted to apply pressures on Israel to commit itself to fully withdrawing. And it was pretty obvious, if you look at the record again, that Israel at that point was able to bring to bear the lobby. In 1967-68, it meant principally the forthcoming presidential election and the Jewish vote. It was able to bring to bear the power of the Jewish vote to resist efforts to withdraw. And since 67, the lobby has been very effective, I think, in raising the threshold before the U.S. is willing to act and force an Israeli withdrawal pretty much like the withdrawal it forced on Indonesia in 2000 to leave Timor. The two occupations begin roughly in the same period. 1974, Indonesia invades Timor with the U.S. green light. 67, Israel conquers the West Bank, Gaza, and so forth with the U.S. green light. And so the obvious question is, both occupations endured for a long period. The Indonesian occupation was infinitely more destructive. It killed about one-third of the East Timorese population. But it's true to say, come 2000, the U.S. does order Indonesia to withdraw its troops. And why hasn't it done so in the case of the Israel-Palestine occupation? And there, I think, it's true to say, it's the lobby.
Okay. I think maybe we want to, I have a feeling that one of the things that we really need to start with when we try to address this issue is what is it that we recognize, if we could recognize, and on more or less a global level, as American interests, such that we can say that they have, to some degree, systematically characterized different administrations, because it seems to me it would be very, very difficult to evaluate to what extent policies that are going on with respect to Israel are or aren't compatible with American interests if we don't talk a little bit about what we perceive to be American interests. So, James, would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I would. As a matter of fact, on that question, we have to be clear that if we're talking about the U.S. government in corporate interests in the Middle East in particular, or if we're talking about what should be.
No, let's talk about what they are, what the aims of, let's say, various administrations are, as opposed to, let's say, what is in the best interest of either the American or the Israeli people, which may be very different.
Very good. All right. On that count, I think it's very clear U.S. policy is directed toward empire building, extending its political, economic, and military control over the world as a whole, and in particular in the Middle East. And it pursues that policy either through military means or through market mechanisms, such as the expansion of cooperation, the capturing of client regimes, etc. And if we look at the Middle East in particular, the U.S. has been very successful in securing agreements with most of the oil-producing countries except Iraq and Iran, and even there it's mainly because of its own rejection of relations with both those countries. U.S. oil companies have done extremely well through non-military means. They have expanded their commercial ties. Goldman Sachs has just signed a big agreement with the biggest Saudi bank. Britain is organizing a secondary market in Islamic bonds. Wall Street is very interested in that. None of the oil companies supported a war in Iraq, and this is part of the rubbish that's been peddled, that the war was about oil. The oil companies were doing fabulous before the war and were very, very nervous about getting involved in a war. This, I think, leads us to the whole question of why then, if it was prejudicial to the major U.S. economic interests. As we can see, there were many military people even that were opposed to going into Iraq because they felt it would prejudice the U.S. overall military capacities to defend the empire, just like the war in Vietnam prejudiced the capacity of the U.S. to intervene in Central America against the Sandinistas, against the overthrow of the Shah, etc. So from the point of view of global imperial interests, the war in Iraq was certainly not on the behest of the oil companies. I've looked at all the documents I've done interviews with oil companies. I've looked at their publications for the 5 years in the run-up to the war, and there's absolutely no evidence. On the contrary, if you pursue research on the various members of the Zionist power configuration in the United States, which I think is a conceptually more correct way of talking about this rather than the lobby, you will find that people of dubious loyalties like Wolfowitz, Feith, Pearl, Elliot Abrams, the felon, that had an agenda of furthering Israel interests.
James, maybe we should sort of go on with this. So basically, if I understand what you're saying, is you're suggesting that, in fact, up to the point of getting involved militarily with Iraq, you would characterize American policies in the Middle East, the lobby notwithstanding, as extremely successful. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it's what we call market imperialism.
Yeah. Norman, you want to comment on this?
Well, you have to look at the interests at many different levels, and unfortunately it becomes murky and complicated. Where one would prefer a simple picture, I don't think it's all that simple when you try to figure it out. Number one, you have to look at the interests in terms of who's defining them. And I agree, I think it's fairly obvious, certainly to your listenership, that there are different interests if they're being defined by corporate power or if they're being defined democratically by the desires and choices of ordinary people in a democratic system. So let's limit ourselves to the question of the corporate interests, because obviously they're playing the dominant role in determining U.S. policy, or it should be obvious. Not always is.
Let's assume it is fairly obvious.
They're playing the determinant role. Then you have to look at, okay, how do they conceive the best way to preserve and expand their interests? Now, the way they perceive it may seem, to a person like you and me, it may seem irrational that they're pursuing policies which are actually hurting them. But the fact that they may seem irrational to us does not mean that those are the way they perceive the best way to preserve their interests. So if you take the concrete case at hand, it may be the case that it was irrational for the U.S. to go into Iraq because there are other ways to control the oil, or as some people have argued, that the market mechanisms are such that, on a world scale, the market mechanisms are such that you no longer need to control a natural resource in order to make sure you get the lowest price or make sure it's flowing at the lowest price. Control isn't all that important anymore in the modern world. It's not like when Lenin was writing his imperialism. Now, that may be rationally correct, and maybe there's a good argument for making it. But that doesn't mean that those in power aren't making decisions to further their own interests, which may seem irrational to us. And in the case of Iraq, if you look concretely at what happens, number one, there is no evidence whatsoever that people like Wolfowitz or the others were trying to further an Israeli agenda.
What would be the Israeli agenda? I mean, actually, let me interrupt. What would be the Israeli agenda if there was one?
There is an Israeli agenda, and I'm not disputing it. The Israeli agenda is basically the following. Israel does not care which country you smash up in the Middle East, just so long as every few years, and sometimes every few months, you smash up this or that Arab country to send a lesson or to transmit the message to the Middle East that we're in charge, and whenever you get out of line, we are going to take out the big club and break your skull. Now, it happens that in the late 1990s, Israel would have preferred if the skull that was cracked was the Iranian one. There was no evidence that Iraq was uppermost on the Israeli agenda. In fact, all of this talk about the famous document that was written up by these neocons to attack Iraq, that famous document was handed to Netanyahu when he came to office to try to convince him to put Iraq at the top of the agenda. It's not as if Israel passed that document to the neocons, who then plotted to get the U.S. government to attack Iraq. It was the opposite. Israel would have preferred to attack Iran. However, once those in our government, maybe for misguided reasons for all I know, decided to fasten on to Iraq, that is, to attack Iraq, Israel was of course gung-ho, because Israel is always gung-ho about smashing up this or that Arab country. That's always been its policy for the last 100 years. Since the beginning of Zionism, the most commonplace, the cliche of Israeli power is the Arabs only understand the language of force. So when the U.S. embarked on its campaign against Iraq, the Israelis were gleeful, but they're always gleeful. It doesn't mean that the people like Wolfowitz, let alone people like Cheney, are trying to serve an Israeli agenda. There's no evidence for claims like that. It's pure speculation based on things like ethnicity. Let's take a simple example, the one that I'll call him James. I don't usually call people by the first name, but let's just call it James Jim Petras mentioned. Let's take the case of Elliot Abrams. These are interesting cases. Elliot Abrams is the son-in-law of Norman Podhoretz. And Norman Podhoretz was the first big neoconservative supporter of Israel, the editor of Commentary magazine. But if you look at people like Podhoretz, you look at their history. I'll take a book which I'm sure Jim is familiar with. In 1967, Podhoretz publishes his famous memoir called Making It. It's how he succeeded and made it in American life. He's a young man. He's the editor of Commentary magazine. You read that book, his celebrated memoir. It's written literally 2 months before the June 1967 war. There is exactly 1/2 of one sentence in the whole book on Israel. People like Podhoretz, Midge Decter, all the neocons. I have gone through the whole literature on the topic. I've read it quite carefully. Before June 1967, they didn't give a hoot about Israel. Israel never comes up in any of their memoirs, any of the histories of the period. They become pro-Israel when Israel is useful to them in their pursuit of power and fortune in the United States. Elliot Abrams is as committed to Israel as his father-in-law, Norman Podhoretz, was committed to Israel, when it's convenient and when it's useful. But this idea of trying to serve an Israeli agenda, especially coming from somebody like as sophisticated as Jim Petras, strikes me as absurd.
Norman, maybe we should move to Jim at this point.
He knows as well as I do. Their power...
It's very strange that one says Wolfowitz was not influenced by the Israeli agenda when he was caught passing documents to Israel in the 80s. Douglas Feith lost his security clearance for handing documents to Israel. Elliot Abrams has written a book calling for the purity of the Jewish
I know they
nation,
write that crap, and you believe them. Jim, you think
it's
they
not
care?
A question of believing them is looking at the documentary evidence of uncritical support for Israel in all of its policies, a position that's taken by the presidents of the major Jewish organizations in the United States.
Let me maybe interject here a little bit.
Support.
Let me perhaps interject here a little bit. I think that there are a couple of things. One is I'm wondering, for instance, I don't know whether you would agree, James, with the particular Israeli interest that Norman had identified with respect to the invasion of Iraq. But assuming that you would agree that the Israeli interest is precisely that, namely smashing some Arab country every once in a while because it's a good idea. The question is whether that also hasn't been an American interest. So we have seen America go after countries which are sometimes, in terms of their power, otherwise are really quite negligible, just so as to make a point that anybody who dares to stand up to American power is just a bad example and needs to be smashed.
Agree with that.
Israel was running guns to Iran as late as 1987 in the infamous Iran-Contra scandal. To say that they weren't interested in destroying Iraq as a challenge to its hegemony and Iraq's support for the Palestinians, particularly funding the families of assassinated Palestinian leaders. That's absurd. And I think,
actually, could I stop you at this particular point because we need to take a station break. So please hold on to this particular thought, and we will come back to it.
Hi, this is Shay Popovich, actor and activist with Neighbors for Peace and Justice, San Fernando Valley.
And I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host of KPFK's morning show Uprising.
We invite you to The Unembedded Truth, an evening with independent journalist Dar Jamel.
From Bechtel's failure to repair Iraq's water treatment plants to the silent tragedy of the widows, Dar Jamel's stories about those most affected by the U.S. occupation, the innocent civilians, are covered by the BBC and the world press, in this country only by alternative media.
On February 17th in Studio City, Dar Jamel will be making a rare appearance to present an update with slideshow of the current conditions in Iraq and to share with us his assessment of future U.S. plans for the Middle East.
That's Saturday, February 17th at 7 p.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Studio City, 12355 Moore Park Street. For more information, call 818-762-6695. That's 818-762-6695 or visit kpfk.org.
KPFK is a media sponsor.
Welcome back. You're listening to Radio Intifada on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, and streaming live at www.kpfk.org. I'm Hagit Boreo. Our guests today are Professor Norman Finkelstein and Professor James Petras, and we are discussing the role of the Israeli lobby in shaping American foreign policy and in creating consent for those policies. Welcome back, Norman and James.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hagit.
I actually wanted...
Hagit, it's all right.
That's okay, yes, absolutely. At this point, I thought maybe we can try to shift the topic a little bit and perhaps...
I finish my last comment?
Yes, please do.
I think when the Pentagon offices are flooded like a crowded bordello on Saturday night with the Israeli intelligence officers crowding out even members of their own Pentagon, full of Mossad, full of Israeli generals, in the making of Iraq policy, I don't think you can say that this is just any old Pentagon officials. I think you can't dismiss the fact that Feith, Wolfowitz, Elliott Abrams have a lifetime commitment to putting Israel's interest as their prime consideration in the Middle East. And I think this is absurd to think that somehow these just happen to be right-wing policymakers that happen to support a militarist policy. Wolfowitz designed the program. Feith put together the special policy board that fabricated the information for the Iraq war. They were constantly consulting on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis with the Israeli government. This has absolutely been documented 100 times, and I think it's impossible to deny this and say, well, it's just, you can't deduce policy from ethnic affiliations. Yes, you can when that ethnic group puts forward a position that puts the primacy on a foreign government at the center of their foreign policy and prejudices the lives of thousands of Americans, its economic interests in the air, and just say, these are a bunch of irrational policymakers.
James, actually, let me pursue this and actually go into a slightly different point, and that is, wouldn't it be possible, that's a question for both of you, wouldn't it be possible, for instance, to think about whatever the neocon group is, as the group that, it's not a group that represents Israeli interests, it's a group that represents interests which happen to perhaps coincide for both countries and which represent alliances of particular politicians of both countries with one another, and particular power configurations in both countries with one another, but not by any means all Israeli politicians or all Israeli power structure or all American politicians or all American power structures.
Absolutely.
So in that case, these are not really American interests. These are just interests of a particular group of people which is just as interested in bringing them to effect in the United States as it is in Israel. It's just basically, if you wish, a wonderful symbiotic relationship. What would you say, Norman, to something like that, let's say?
I've said, in my remarks at the beginning, there is an overlapping of interests on a regional level for reasons which, in part, you yourself suggested earlier. You said that the United States often goes after weak regimes as a kind of demonstration effect of its power, and Israel also has a desire for demonstrating its power, and often there is, as I said, an overlapping or confluence of interests. I think, however, it's also true to say, on the specific question of the occupation, there is a conflict of interests, and where there not a lobby, it's quite likely that the U.S. would have exerted the kinds of pressure which are needed to force an Israeli withdrawal. But on questions like Iraq and Iran, I don't see any evidence whatsoever that it's being driven by cloak and dagger type operations in the Pentagon. These operations which Jim mentions are so trivial next to the very high-level planning that goes on between the United States and Israel, conscious, legal, high-level planning that goes on between Israel and the United States on a daily basis. High-level planning and high-level coordination. You don't have to conjure up cloak and dagger tales, many of them true, cloak and dagger tales going on inside the Pentagon in order to demonstrate that there is collusion, planning, and coordination between the U.S. and Israel. The question is not whether that goes on. The question is whose interests are being served by it. And this notion that somehow they are managing to distort, deform U.S. policy in a crucial region on a crucial resource doesn't, in my opinion, have any basis in fact. And it defies any kind of reason, any kind of commonsensical reasoning, especially coming from, in my youth, I used to be a student of James Petras at SUNY Binghamton, 1971 to 74, and he used to be, I think, a Marxist, and at that time he would tell you how people in power act from interests which spring from they act on the basis of the interests in which they are the ones who are the main beneficiaries.
Norman, let me ask you.
One second. Mr. Wolfowitz, Mr. Wolfowitz, Mr. Feist, and all the others, their power springs from the American state. If Israel gets stronger, their power does not increase. If the United States gets weaker, their power decreases. So now we're having this weird phenomenon of people, due to their ethnic loyalties, are willing to strengthen another state and weaken the sources of power from which their power comes. That doesn't sound believable.
Kind of convoluted thinking. I'm sure Norman didn't take that logic from my classes. I'm afraid he's gone off the track somewhere, despite some very good books he's written on the Zionist shakedowns on the Holocaust and the refutation of the plagiarism of Dershowitz. I'm afraid when it comes to dealing with the predominantly Jewish lobby, he has a certain blind spot, which is understandable in many other national and ethnic groups where they can criticize the world, but when it comes to identifying the power and malfeasance of their own group.
I think maybe we should all...
There's nothing cloak and dagger about
no, I know,
the operations.
But perhaps we can move away from this specific topic, okay?
One sentence, okay? There's nothing cloak and dagger about the multiplicity of pro-Israel groups that have pressured Congress, that have involved in the executive body in shaping American policy in the Middle East. The U.S. does not support any other colonial power, has opposed colonial occupation imperialism since World War II. They opposed the Suez in 56, 55. They have been pushing these countries, Europe and other countries, out in order to establish U.S. hegemony through economic and military agreements. So the Israeli is very different from the policies the U.S. follows everywhere else in the world. It's the only country that gets $3 billion a year for 30 years. So this is not just something that happens because of cloak and dagger. This is the result, as Norman knows as a very brilliant analyst, from organized power, an organized power that openly admits and states, and its groupies state very explicitly that Israel is their major concern, and what's good for Israel is good for the United States. They say that, Norman.
I know they say
okay,
that.
Okay, let me interrupt you because I need to do a station ID, and maybe we could change a topic after that.
Okay, Norman
you're listening to Radio Intifada on KPFK. We are broadcasting on 90.7 in Los Angeles. We are talking to Professors Norman Finkelstein and James Petras about the role of the Jewish lobby. And I think that we can at this point agree that you guys have a lot of mutual respect for each other, but also obviously you do not agree on some topics. And I wanted to move on to the question of whether there are, and I think this is a crucial case, and that is whether there are in fact cases that show that when that there are really issues, which presumably there would be, where there are conflicts of interest between the United States and Israel, that the United States does in fact, let's say, pressure Israel, at least in some cases, to act in ways which are against what Israeli wishes would be. Because it seems to me that if we don't find cases along these lines, then basically the discussion becomes kind of in the eyes of the beholder. You know, we see certainly we see a lot of cooperation, a lot of joint interests, but they could be coming from either side. It's the cases where there is perhaps where the interests part ways and and where we can see, in fact, that there is a discord, that we can talk about this. So, Norman, since you're the one who believes that this is in fact a possible thing, could you talk about that?
Well, the thing is, I don't want to make the argument that these kinds of individual cases can prove one side or the other. You pick up a book by Steve Zunis, and he's going to demonstrate that the U.S. government always gets his way. You pick up something by somebody on the other side, and they're going to demonstrate that it's Israel that always gets its way when there are conflicts of interest. And each side can give a list of examples to demonstrate his or her case. And I don't think you can prove anything by citing a handful of cases on one side. Professor Chomsky will cite the recent case where Israel was severely reprimanded by Bush for trying to sell technology to China, and then you'll find cases on the other side. Even though it's, of course, important to look at the empirical record, I don't think the empirical record in and of itself resolves the question. Let me give you a couple of examples of how I think it works. Let's take two prime examples. Let's start with 1948. Why did President Truman recognize Israel? There's all sorts of debate about that question. One claim that's constantly made is that it was the Jewish lobby, namely Truman was heading for election and wanted in particular the New York vote, and the Democratic Party wanted Jewish money. And it was due to the Jewish lobby of its time that Truman quickly recognized Israel, even though he was bound to alienate Arab interests, which were hostile, very hostile to Israel's founding. What does the record show? I've gone through the record very carefully. The record shows as follows. Number one, our main interest at that time was in Saudi oil. And the U.S. enters into discussions with the Saudis. What will you allow the U.S. government to do regarding the founding of the State of Israel? And the Saudis basically say the following. We will let you recognize Israel, but if you supply arms, then there's going to be trouble, arms after Israel is founded and the imminent war. What does the U.S. do? It recognizes Israel, that is to say, it goes the limit. Truman goes the limit because he wants that Jewish vote and he wants Jewish money, but he immediately slaps an arms embargo on the region. And Secretary of State Marshall at the time says, it looks like Israel is going to lose the war. That's what our intelligence told us. We were wrong. But that's what U.S. intelligence said at the time. So they were willing to let Israel be annihilated, because that's what our intelligence told us, if the price was losing the support of the Saudis. It is true, Truman went the limit. The limit was recognizing Israel to get the Jewish vote. But he never went beyond the limit of alienating a prime U.S. interest in the region, namely the Saudis. Let's take 1956, which Jim mentioned, but I don't think he knows what happened. In 1956, it's true, the United States told Britain, France, and Israel they have to get out of Egypt. And it's true we looked very anti-colonial. But the only reason the United States did that was because the British, the French, and the Israelis acted behind the back of the United States. The very moment the tripartite invasion of Egypt occurred, the U.S. was plotting to overthrow the government of Syria at that very moment. And the U.S. wanted to knock out Nasser, but they didn't like the timing, because the timing was not the U.S. choosing, it was the British, French, and Israelis behind our backs. Once again, it was the U.S. interest that determined U.S. policy, not any commitment to anti-colonialism or crap like that. It was the U.S. interest.
He's had 5 minutes already. I demand equal time.
Okay, please go ahead, James. You're right.
Okay, he's been giving us long lectures.
That's okay, James. Please just go ahead.
Yes. If you look at U.S. policy to Israel, we alienate practically the whole world in favor of a tiny country which has virtually no economic value to the United States, is a diplomatic albatross, and has its own hegemonic military political interest in dominating the Middle East. We go into the United Nations, we alienate the whole of Europe, the Third World, when Israel destroys Jenin, when it engages in genocidal policies in the occupied territories, it violates the Geneva Agreements. The U.S. backs it and totally discredits itself to anyone seriously concerned with international law, with the niceties of international relations. I'm not just talking about Muslim opinion, Arab opinion. I'm talking about world opinion. Secondly, to say that the United States overlapping interests with Israel is totally off the wall. I mean, I don't know where Norman's head is. The United States gets involved in countries to set up neo-colonial regimes. They're not into occupying and setting up colonial governments. They prefer local clients. And they had one in Lebanon with the president, Senoria, who was receiving U.S. backing when Israel attacks Lebanon, presumably to attack Hezbollah, totally undermines the U.S. puppet. Is that in U.S. interest?
Yes.
And when you talk about the fact that Israel is taking measures overlapping with U.S. policymakers, you're overlooking the fact that most of the generals were opposed to the war, and the Israeli agents in the United States, and that's what they are, they should register as foreign agents of a foreign power, were attacking them as wimps, were attacking them because they wouldn't follow the war precepts of the Zionists in the Pentagon. There's a whole string of military officials, conservative politicians who are opposed to going into Iraq. And if you look at the data and if you look at Cheney was getting his information from Irving Libby, another Landsman, another member of the fraternity linked to Wolfowitz. He's a protege of Wolfowitz.
I think Cheney can think for himself.
If you're trying to set up a matrix of power dealing with U.S. policymaking in the Middle East, to simply say that this is shared interest without looking at the fact that the Israelis blew up a U.S. surveillance ship, killed scores of U.S. sailors, and get away with it and continue to get economic aid, and the U.S. officers that were murdered by the Israeli warplanes with the U.S. flags flying over the ship, and say that's overlapping interests. That's chutzpah. That is really chutzpah. And it's very revealing that you went into a detailed explanation, or purported to be explanation, about the Suez, that you leave out in 1967 that the Israelis are the only country in world U.S. history that bombs a U.S. warship carrying airplanes and doesn't even have to apologize and receives no retaliation from the United States. Now that's power for you. That's influence for you. And I think to deny these realities and say, just overlapping interests. The Zionists have no power in the U.S. government. If they are Zionists, they're not tied to Israel, etc. That's a strange kind of Zionist that don't have allegiance to the state of Israel.
I want to ask you about we have only 5 minutes left, even less. There are a couple of things that I wanted to cover, and maybe the most important one has to do with the fact that this debate, the debate about the Israel lobby in general, has broken surface into the mainstream in the last, let's say, year or so. Of course, a lot of it had to do with the Mearsheimer and Walt article, and subsequently, let's say, by the attacks on Carter's book. But there were attacks before, and there were reviews of the role of the lobby and debates about the role of the lobby before. So, but they never made it to mainstream, and they never just reviewed, let's say, by the New York Review of Books, and they were never discussed in major outlets in the United States. In fact, the Mearsheimer and Walt article originally was turned down for publication by the Atlantic magazine that had commissioned it. So maybe you can comment a little bit, the two of you, on why is it that this debate is finally breaking surface, and why is it that it is now a much more legitimate thing to debate within American mainstream circles?
I think there are 3 fast reasons. One is because of the disaster in Iraq. The public is open to a discussion, particularly with the prominence of Zionists in bringing about the war. So I think you have public opinion open because of their discontent with the war and their concern about who got us into the war and who got us into the mess. The second reason is that there's an inter-elite fight in the United States between sectors of the military, sectors of Congress, conservatives, with the pro-Israel crowd, the pro-war crowds. And the third reason is the arrogance and bullying by the Zionists, and particularly their organizations that go around trying to prevent discussion, has really backfired. And I think people are fed up with the Zionists banning Corey, the play in New York and elsewhere. So I think
James, we have to move on. We have a minute and a half. So Norman, could you say some final words?
Well, I agree with the reasons. Maybe I wouldn't state them quite the same way as Jim does. It's clear the debacle in Iraq forms the overall framework for the opening up of discussion. In my opinion, that's probably not the most positive result, because it's going to end up in, I think, creating a scapegoat for a disastrous war by the U.S. I think the second reason is that the Israeli approach, which seemed to have been successful since '67, the approach of simply applying force to every insurgency or every break-in, a conformity with U.S. policy, this policy of applying overwhelming force, plainly is not working, and so there are questions about the usefulness of Israel's guidance and instruction in how to control the Middle East. It's not worked in Iraq, and it proved to be a disaster in Lebanon this summer. So there's the whole question of the effectiveness of the Israeli approach, in addition to the effectiveness of Israel itself as a strategic asset, which is very different than it was in 1967. And the third reason, it seems to me, is that Israel is becoming more and more what you might call a bloated banana republic, with scandals daily and this kind of squandering of resources. And that being the case, it's alienated large sectors of American liberal Jewish opinion.
I thank you very much, James and Norman, and I think on this point of accord between you, we need to end. Thank you so very much for being here. This perspective has most recently been associated with an article in the London Book Review authored by Professors Mearsheimer of Chicago University and Professor Walt of Harvard University. This debate is the topic of our program today. Let me introduce our guests. Norman Finkelstein is a professor of political science at DePaul University. Welcome to our program, Norman. Norman?
I'm here.
Okay. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Professor Finkelstein is the author of a number of books and articles on the history of Zionism and on the role of Holocaust in Israeli present-day policies. His latest book, published in 2005, is Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. Our second guest is James Petras. James is an emeritus professor of sociology at SUNY Binghamton. Welcome to our program, James.
Glad to be here, Hagit.
Okay. Professor Petras is the author of numerous books and articles on the making of state power and globalization in the context of the U.S. and Latin America, and most recently in the Middle East. His latest book, published in 2006, is titled The Power of Israel in the United States. Perhaps starting with you, James, maybe you could tell us just by way of a short opening statement where you would place yourself on this issue of a debate on the source of the United States' lasting and enduring support of Israel.
Well, I think I would strongly argue that the pro-Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, is the dominant factor in shaping U.S. policy, particularly in the most recent period. And I think one has to look at this beyond AIPAC. I mean, we have to look at a whole string of pro-Zionist think tanks from the American Enterprise Institute on down, and then we have to look at a whole power configuration which not only involves AIPAC, but the president of the major American Jewish organizations, which number 52. We have to look at individuals occupying crucial positions in the government, as we had recently with
Welcome to Radio Intifada, voices from Calcutta to Casablanca, voices of struggle, voices for change. We are broadcasting on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, and streaming live at www.kpfk.org. I'm Hagit Borer. There's little question in anybody's mind of the special relationship between Israel and the United States. Israel is the largest recipient of American foreign aid to the tune of more than $3 billion a year, plus miscellaneous additional aid in surplus weaponry, debt waivers, and other perks. Israel is the only country that receives its entire aid in the beginning of the fiscal year, allowing it to accrue interest on it during the year. It's the circles one often hears that the reason is primarily moral. The debt that the United States owes Israel in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the nature of Israel as the sole democracy in the Middle East, Israel as a moral and possibly strategic ally of the United States in its war on terror. Within circles that are less supportive of Israel and which are less inclined to view Israel and Israel's conduct as moral, opinions vary as well. One perspective is that the U.S. support of Israel stems from Israel being a strategic asset to the United States. Its support is simply payment for services rendered, coupled with the stable pro-American stance of the Jewish Israeli population. Noam Chomsky, among others, is a proponent of this view. According to the opposing view, United States support for Israel does not advance American foreign policy aims, it jeopardizes them. The explanation for the support is to be found in the activities of the Israel Lobby, also known as the Jewish Lobby, or as AIPAC, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, which uses its formidable influence to shape American foreign policy in accordance with Israeli interests. The only country that is allowed to spend up to 25% of its aid outside the United States, placing such expenditures outside U.S. control. Apart from financial support, the United States had offered unwavering support for the Israeli occupation and for the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians, and has systematically cooperated with Israel's refusal to enter any effective peace negotiations or peace agreements. It has vetoed countless UN resolutions seeking to condemn Israel and to bring it into compliance with international law. It has allowed Israel to develop nuclear weapons and not to sign the Anti-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and most recently, it strongly supported Israel's attack on Lebanon in July of 2006. Support for Israel cuts across party lines and is extremely strong in Congress, where criticism of Israel is rarely, if ever, heard. It also characterizes almost all American administrations from Johnson onwards, with George W. Bush being possibly the most pro-Israeli president ever. What is the reason for this strong support? Opinions on this matter vary greatly. Within strong pro-Israeli circles,